The ocean was calm when the announcement came over the loudspeakers. We will not be entering Chinese waters. 1,200 passengers froze mid-breakfast as the ship's bow turned north, away from Shanghai toward the Korean coast. Beijing had set a new rule. Any American vessel entering a Chinese port must pay a special fee, $56 per net ton. That's how a luxury U.S. cruise liner, days from its most profitable destination, suddenly became the first casualty of an economic retaliation that could rewrite Pacific trade itself. And it all started with one ship refusing to pay. China's Ministry of Transport had announced that it would levy 400 yuan per net ton, about $56, on vessels with U.S. links, escalating annually, a policy described as a countermeasure to new U.S. port fees set to hit China-linked ships. The rule applies at the first Chinese port of call and can be billed on one voyage or the first 5 in a year, with failure to pay halting import and export procedures. The U.S. policy came first. Washington prepared to charge fees on ships built in China or tied to Chinese ownership or operation at their first U.S. port call, a move estimated to cost top carriers $3.2 billion over the following year. Analysts said per-call charges could exceed $1 million on large container ships, rising each year. Within days, the tit-for-tat policies began to reshape schedules across the Pacific. Industry executives said operators were pulling China-linked tonnage from U.S. lanes to avoid American fees and shifting U.S.-linked ships away from China routes to sidestep Beijing's levy, squeezing capacity and pushing up freight rates. The Shanghai Containerized Freight Index jumped nearly 13% to a 4-week high in the period following China's announcement. The Riviera became a passenger-facing example of how policy can translate into itinerary disruption. The last-minute diversion and the reported $1.64 million figure for that call underscored how cruise economics, driven by ticket yield, onboard spending, and port fees, can be materially altered by sudden policy shifts. Container lines made similar calculations. Reports showed that carriers responded by skipping China visits, illustrating how a single clause about ownership, operation, flag, or build can ripple into network design. China paired its fee with specific exemptions. State broadcaster details said Chinese-built ships were exempt, and vessels entering empty for repair could also qualify, with an annual billing cycle beginning in mid-October. Officials warned that unpaid fees would stall customs processing for the ship. That exemption logic mattered for cruise as well. Royal Caribbean's Spectrum of the Seas docked in Shanghai after obtaining a waiver, with officials indicating the exemption appeared tailored to vessels home-ported in China and carrying overwhelmingly Chinese passengers, rather than a blanket waiver for all U.S.-owned cruise ships. So, fees did not emerge in a vacuum. The investigation groundwork was actually laid under the prior administration and moved forward in 2024 and 2025. The U.S. Trade Representative initiated a Section 301 probe into China's maritime, logistics, and shipbuilding sectors at the request of U.S. unions and published a detailed report and determination. The agency argued that China's policies fostered dominance via subsidies and restricted competition, harming U.S. industry. Financial Times coverage described how shipowners raced to refinance away from Chinese sale and leaseback structures to avoid being classified as Chinese-owned under the U.S. fee rule, which really underscored that legal ownership definitions, often buried in financing terms, can trigger fee liability even when day-to-day operations are managed elsewhere. Chinese authorities, framed their response as reciprocal. Beijing's transport ministry announced the retaliatory fee just hours before U.S. authorities were to start charging China-linked ships in American ports. The Chinese measure covered vessels owned, operated, built in, or flagged by the United States. For Riviera's operator, the arithmetic narrowed quickly. A 400 yuan per net ton charge scales rapidly on a mid-size cruise ship, and the reported $1.64 million figure for the Shanghai call showed why a last-minute Detour was rational once the fee took effect. Passenger-facing consequences included missed tours and altered hotel and air arrangements, but the company avoided a charge that, spread over a single call, could easily dwarf onboard revenue from a day in port. On the cargo side, strategic responses followed. Ships rerouted, owners repapered financing, and charterers priced a complexity premium into spot business. The market began treating political configuration, flag, build, financing, management as a logistics variable alongside speed, fuel burn, and slot price. The policy pause reported later hinted at reversibility. but operators were already rewriting playbooks to protect against flip-flops. The account of the pause included on-the-record remarks from the Treasury Secretary, but there was no immediate indication that carriers would unwind changes until legal text matched the headlines. Schedules, once adjusted, rarely snap back mid-quarter without cost. In this environment, a cruise ship's unexpected turn became an early signal of a freight recalibration. One ship avoided a seven-figure invoice. A cluster of container vessels avoided calling China, and a set of financing teams rewrote covenants to preempt definitions that trigger fees. The result was measurable in public indices and private spreadsheets, higher spot rates, fewer eligible hulls for key lanes, and a growing list of administrative exemptions that could be granted or revoked by ministries on short notice. What happens next depends on whether the temporary pause hardens into rule changes and whether definitions of ownership and control are tightened or loosened. If escalators resume, the path to 1,120 yuan per net ton by 2028 would compound per-call exposure and entrench avoidance strategies. If exemptions broaden, call patterns might normalize at the margin. Either path is visible from a balcony on deck 14. If the itinerary shows Shanghai again next season and the fee text remains intact, the ship's bow will either swing for the Huangpu or retrace the same quiet arc back to Busan. The ripple effects of the dual port fee announcements are now quantifiable. U.S. shipping company Matson Inc. disclosed that since the Chinese levy began on October 14th, it has paid $6.4 million in port fees to China. That payment underscores how even firms without manifest war chests are now feeling the operational bite of the policy. According to the company's CEO, Matt Cox, had the fees persisted unabated, annual exposures in 2026 to 2027 could have approached $80 million. Simultaneously, both governments agreed to a 12-month suspension of the tit-for-tat fees, announced after a meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and China's Xi Jinping. The pause covers the estimated $3.2 billion in annual fees anticipated for large Chinese-built vessels docking in U.S. ports. The suspension signals that the confrontation is not yet immutable law but remains highly contingent on political will and negotiation. Crunching the numbers, the U.S. investigation under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 found China's ship and port-dominated shipping sector problematic for U.S. interests, noting China's share of global shipbuilding exceeded 50% in 2023 versus U.S. below 1%. That pre-existing structural shift gives context to the fee measures. They are not merely trade burdens but responses to built-in imbalances. The consequence is that operators, financiers, and logisticians are now treating ship flag, shipbuild origin, and financing structure as direct cost centers rather than auxiliary risk factors. A complexity premium has emerged. Analysts quoted by Reuters say the number of available vessels to call Chinese ports has declined, tightening capacity and lifting freight indices. For supertankers, estimates suggest the Chinese levy could add more than $7 per barrel in shipping cost when a heavy vessel is linked to U.S. ownership. That translates to around $15 million added cost on a single very large crude carrier call. The money is real and immediate. China's fee logic also has quirks. As Reuters reported, China began charging what they call special port fees on United States-linked vessels docked in Chinese ports, specifically targeting United States-built ships, United States-flagged vessels, vessels operated by United States entities, or where United States citizens own more than 25% of voting rights, among other dimensions. Yet, Chinese-built and Chinese-flagged vessels are exempt under Beijing's rule, reinforcing that the levy is really targeted at United States flag and United States-linked vessels rather than being a blanket policy. The exemption logic honestly creates opportunities for carve-outs and, creative engineering. For cargo operators, the calculus gets granular fast. A container vessel originally planning to call at Ningbo might choose instead Busan or Pusan in South Korea, unload the cargo there, and then transship overland into China, because the alternative, a direct call to a Chinese port with a United States-linked flag, would invite a seven-figure fee. The result? Added drayage, more transit time, extra documentation, and extra carriers. But all of this is rationalized versus just paying the straight fee and taking on the risk. The question becomes, would the customer accept a higher landed cost, or would the ship owner reroute and absorb a margin squeeze? Political calculations honestly run deep below the deck. The United States announced earlier that it would reform shipbuilding policy. An executive order aimed to revive domestic shipbuilding capacity and reduce dependence on foreign, especially Chinese yards, while imposing tax credits, registry reforms, and port fee penalties to reshape the industry. That plan means the spatial map of world-building ownership and flagging is shifting. Shipping is no longer just logistics, it is geopolitics. Yet there are clear unintended consequences. Industry executives testified that the United States scheme could hurt United States exporters, port operators, and inland supply chains because, raising costs for shipping doesn't only affect Chinese-linked vessels. It can actually cascade to global costs for coal, agriculture, and manufacturing. Indeed, the initial disruptions already show container capacity became constrained, rates rose, and downstream purchasers faced increased landed costs. The suspension of fees is a pause, not resolution. The deal between Trump and Xi paused fees for 12 months, but did not erase the rule sets, definitions, or future escalators. Market observers point out that schedules already altered are unlikely to revert overnight. Contracts, charters, and supply chains have adjusted to the new normal. Within the pause window, shipping lines are playing scenario hockey, optimizing for either a return of full fees, altered definitions, or broader exemptions. From a finance viewpoint, the stakes are considerable. Analysts estimated that Chinese carrier COSCO shipping lines faced nearly half of the expected $3.2 billion annual fee burden under United States rules. That exposure alone forces boardroom decisions on calling United States ports, deploying Chinese-built hulls, and possibly curtailing services instead of paying. For United States operators, disruption looms if they route around China visits entirely and face capacity spikes elsewhere. So what does this mean for global trade? Well, shipping lanes are, morphing into economic trenches. The route origin map is being redrawn based on ownership and flag rather than just geography. For instance, ships might call at South Korean or Southeast Asian ports, transfer cargo inland to China, or service Chinese markets via secondary flows. The effect? Longer transit times, elevated costs, increased handling, and ultimately rising end prices for consumers and industries. In passenger cruise specifically, the story is illustrative. When a luxury U.S.-operated ship diverted from Shanghai to Busan to avoid a roughly $1.64 million fee, that became the marquee headline. But for the broader fleet, the change is systemic. Hundreds of cruise and cargo ships routinely call China on Asia itineraries. Each call now must be evaluated for exposure, exemption eligibility, ownership link risk, and repositioning surplus cost. The tourism sector too feels the upstream impact. Port cities may lose calls, itineraries shorten, and alternative ports benefit, but at cost to legacy routes. Tactically, carriers are deploying two parallel tracks: carve-out engineering via exemptions and non-Chinese registration, and strategic avoidance via route redesign. The combination is unfolding in real time. Vessel fleets show signs of redeployment. Away from China heavy loops, charterers are adjusting tender metrics to include fee risk, and financiers are renegotiating leases to reduce Chinese origin lineage. Thus, shipping risk now includes geopolitical classification, not just fuel, speed, and slot cost. Finally, while the headlines focus on port fees in isolation, the broader framing is critical. This is not a conventional tariff war over goods. It's a battle over control of sea-based infrastructure, shipbuilding capacity, and strategic maritime networks. The U.S. is signaling that maritime dominance matters as much as semiconductor dominance. China is likewise signaling that its global shipyards and port reach underpin far more than benign commerce. The shipping lane that once silently carried goods now carries strategic freight. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.